The year is 1982. The month is August, a fleeting season of reprieve in the savage heart of the Kamchatka Peninsula. Here, on the far eastern edge of the Soviet Empire, the world feels unfinished, a raw sketch of creation drawn in basalt and steam. This is a land of giants, a place where more than 300 volcanoes claw at a sky the color of cold iron, 100 of them still breathing, still dreaming of fire. It is a place of profound isolation, a peninsula sealed not only by the icy grip of the Okhotsk and Bering Seas, but by the paranoid fist of the state. This is a military exclusion zone, a fortress of submarine pens and early warning radar arrays pointed accusingly at the Alaskan coastline, a mere whisper across the water. To be here is to be nowhere, to be forgotten by Moscow, to be a ghost in the grand machine, and it is in this magnificent, terrible emptiness, inside the gaping maw of the Mutnovsky volcano, that our story begins. A team of 5 Soviet geologists, men more comfortable with the silence of rock than the chatter of cities, are nearing the end of their survey. Their mission is prosaic, a state-mandated quest for geothermal potential, a search for heat that could one day power the remote garrisons and settlements clinging to this inhospitable coast. Their leader is Viktor Orlov, a man whose face is a roadmap of Arctic winds and Siberian sun, a geologist of the old school who believes the Earth speaks a language of pressure and time, a language he has spent a lifetime learning to interpret. On this particular evening, the language of the Earth began to change. The air, usually thick with the sulphurous breath of fumaroles, grew strangely still. The perpetual hiss of escaping steam seemed to fall silent, as if the volcano were holding its breath. A tremor ran through the crater floor, not the familiar, violent shudder of an earthquake, but a deep, resonant hum, a vibration that felt less geological and more mechanical. It was a frequency that bypassed the ears and settled deep in the chest, a thrumming that vibrated in the fillings of their teeth. Orlov and his men exchanged uneasy glances. They were scientists, rationalists, products of an ideology that had no room for omens. But they were also men of the wilderness, their instincts honed by a lifetime of listening to the subtle warnings of the natural world. And the world was screaming. Then came the light. It did not erupt from the central vent in a plume of fire and ash. It bloomed. From the very heart of the caldera, a soft internal luminescence began to grow, painting the jagged crater walls in shades of impossible cobalt and violet. It was a cold light, a sterile light that absorbed sound and cast no shadows. The geologists, tools forgotten in their hands, could only stare as the illumination intensified, pulsing in time with the low-frequency hum that now seemed to emanate from the very bedrock beneath their feet. What was this? Some unrecorded geothermal phenomenon? A plasma discharge triggered by a unique confluence of magnetic and atmospheric pressures? Orlov's mind raced through a dozen scientific explanations, each one more inadequate than the last. And then it rose. Slowly, majestically, with a silence that was more profound than any sound, an object of impossible geometry ascended from the glowing heart of the crater. It was a perfect, multifaceted diamond, a crystalline structure the size of a 5-story apartment block. Its surface was not metal, not rock, not any substance known to man. It was a flawless obsidian lens that did not reflect the dying light of the sunset, but seemed to swallow it whole. Around its razor-sharp edges, the air shimmered and warped, reality itself bending around its form like water around a stone. It hovered, motionless, 100 meters above the crater floor, a silent god born from the belly of the earth. There was no heat, no exhaust, no sound of engines. It simply hung there, a defiant violation of every known law of physics. The 5 men stood frozen, their breath catching in their throats, their minds struggling to process the sheer, terrifying impossibility of what they were seeing. Every instinct screamed at them to run, to hide, to burrow into the volcanic scree like frightened animals. But they could not move. They were held captive by a spectacle of such alien grandeur that it paralyzed the very seat of reason. This was not a machine of human hands. The Soviet state, for all its might, could not build silent diamonds that floated on the air. This was something else, something ancient, something utterly terrifyingly other. As they watched, pinpricks of light ignited across its dark facets, moving in complex, intelligent patterns, like a star chart for a galaxy that had never known a sun. The object was not just present, it was aware. And in that moment, under the gaze of a silent, crystalline god in the heart of a forgotten volcano, Viktor Orlov and his men understood a terrible, exhilarating truth. The world they thought they knew, the solid, predictable world of rock and ice and scientific certainty, was a fragile illusion, and that illusion had just been shattered. What force could command such a vessel? What intelligence could craft such perfection? And most unsettling of all, what was it doing here, in the fiery throat of a Soviet volcano, at the edge of the end of the world? The questions hung in the freezing air, as vast and as silent as the object itself. The answers, they suspected, would not be found in any of their textbooks. The silence that followed its arrival was an entity in itself, a living presence that pressed in on them, amplifying the frantic beating of their own hearts. For an eternity that might have been minutes or merely seconds, the universe consisted only of 5 stunned men and one impossible object. To understand the gravity of that moment, to truly grasp the profound dislocation it represented, one must first understand the men who witnessed it and the land that shaped them. Viktor Orlov was not a man given to flights of fancy. Born in the Urals, forged in the geological institutes of Leningrad, he was a creature of logic and empirical evidence. His world was one of strata, fault lines, and mineral composition. He had charted vast swaths of the Siberian taiga, survived winters that would freeze the soul, and faced down bears with nothing more than a signal flare and an unwavering resolve. His reports to the Ministry of Geology were models of dispassionate, factual observation. He was, in every sense, a model Soviet scientist, pragmatic, materialistic, and deeply skeptical of anything that could not be measured, weighed, or broken down into its constituent elements. His team was cast from the same mold. There was Dmitry, the young, ambitious seismologist from Novosibirsk, eager to make his name. There was Pavel, the grizzled drilling engineer from Donbass, a man who had spent 30 years wrestling with the Earth's crust. And there were the 2 assistants, Sergei and Ivan, quiet, hard-working men who knew the rhythms of the wilderness better than the politics of the Kremlin. These were not impressionable youths or superstitious peasants. They were hardened professionals, their minds disciplined by the rigors of their profession and the unyielding realities of their environment. To them, a mystery was simply a problem for which the data was not yet complete, but the object hanging in the air before them was not a problem. It was a paradox. It was an answer to a question no one had ever thought to ask. Their crucible, the Kamchatka Peninsula, was a land that bred such men. It is a primal landscape, a place where the planet's tectonic plates grind against each other with furious, creative violence. It is a geological infant, still hot and steaming from the forge of creation. The indigenous Itelmen and Koryak peoples who have inhabited this land for millennia have always understood its power. Their cosmology is not one of distant celestial gods, but of potent terrestrial spirits. They speak of the Gorny Duki, the mountain spirits, and of Bilukai, a powerful shaman who is said to travel into the underworld through the mouths of volcanoes. Their myths are filled with tales of strange lights in the sky, of fiery beings that emerge from the earth, and of places where the veil between worlds is thin. To the Soviet authorities, these were merely the primitive superstitions of a backward people, destined to be swept away by the tide of scientific socialism. But could it be that these ancient stories were not fantasies, but rather a different kind of report? A record of recurring phenomena, described in the language of myth because no other language was sufficient. The very isolation that made Kamchatka a strategic military asset also made it a perfect laboratory for the unexplained. It is a vast, underpopulated wilderness, larger than the United Kingdom, with a population density of less than 1 person per square kilometer. What might happen in these vast, unblinking solitudes, far from the watchful eyes of civilization? How many strange lights might dance over the volcanic peaks, unseen and unrecorded? How many silent diamonds might rise from the craters, their passage noted only by the wind and the snow? The Soviet state had its own mythology, a faith in progress, technology, and the ultimate mastery of nature. But Kamchatka resisted such mastery. It was a place that reminded humanity of its smallness, of the immense untamable forces that churned just beneath the surface of the earth and perhaps just beyond the limits of our perception. The geologists' mission was itself a testament to this struggle. They were there to map the volcano's geothermal energy, to literally tap into the power of the underworld for the benefit of the state. They were agents of reason and progress, attempting to impose order on a chaotic elemental force. And it was here, at the nexus of ancient myth and modern science, in a place both strategically vital and cosmically remote, that the phenomenon occurred. The appearance of the object was therefore not just a scientific anomaly, it was a philosophical crisis. It challenged not only the geologists' understanding of physics, but their entire worldview. It was a direct affront to the predictable, materialistic universe in which they had been taught to believe. It suggested that the Atelmen myths of fire spirits and the Soviet doctrines of scientific atheism were both profoundly incomplete. The truth, it seemed, was something far stranger, something that could not be contained by either myth or materialism. As Orlov stared at the silent craft, he felt the bedrock of his own certainty begin to fracture. The compass of his mind, which had always pointed reliably toward the magnetic north of logic, was now spinning wildly, unmoored from reality. The land itself, which he had always seen as a complex but ultimately understandable system of geological forces, now seemed to hold a secret, an intelligence that was ancient and utterly alien. The volcano was not just a mountain of rock and magma, it was a gateway. And something had just passed through. The men were not just witnesses, they were intruders, standing on the threshold of a mystery that was not meant for human eyes. The implications were staggering. If such things existed, what else was possible? What other secrets did the deep, unobserved corners of the world hold? And what did this intelligence want with the raw, elemental power of a terrestrial volcano? The questions multiplied, each one more unsettling than the last, echoing in the vast, imposing silence of the crater. The men, once masters of their small scientific domain, were now reduced to their most basic state, small, fragile creatures confronted by a power they could not hope to comprehend. Their science had failed them. Their ideology had failed them. All that was left was the raw, primal experience of awe and the cold, creeping tendril of absolute terror. News in the Soviet Union did not travel. It was carried selectively through approved channels, or it seeped like contraband through the cracks in the monolithic state. The story of what happened in the Mutnovsky caldera did not appear in Pravda or Izvestia. It became a whisper, a rumor passed between trusted colleagues in smoke-filled laboratories, a fragmented tale told by a nervous helicopter pilot to a friend in a remote Siberian outpost. And it was one of these whispers that reached the ears of Dr. Arvid Zaitsev. Zaitsev was a brilliant man, a theoretical physicist whose career had been derailed by his own inconvenient genius. In the rigid, dogmatic world of Soviet science, his mind was too restless, too willing to entertain ideas that bordered on the heretical. His work on zero-point energy and gravitational anomalies had been deemed too speculative, too far outside the accepted paradigms. He had questioned the unquestionable, and for his intellectual sins, he had been effectively exiled from the prestigious institutes of Moscow and Leningrad. He now found himself at a small, forgotten research station on the outskirts of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, the peninsula's capital, ostensibly studying atmospheric phenomena, but in reality, counting the days in a state of academic purgatory. Zaitsev was a man accustomed to looking for patterns where others saw only noise. He had a reputation for being obsessive, a scientific detective who collected disparate data points and wove them into startling, often unsettling, tapestries of theory. When he heard the fragmented story of the geothermal anomaly at Mutnovsky, his finely tuned senses for the strange and the suppressed began to vibrate. The official story was thin, full of jargon and conspicuously lacking in detail. A sudden, unexpected release of subterranean gases had created a rare form of ball lightning, a massive plasma vortex that had unfortunately damaged the geologists' sensitive equipment and required their immediate evacuation for medical observation. It was a neat, tidy explanation. It was also, to Zaitsev's mind, utterly preposterous. Plasma vortices of that scale would have left a clear and unmistakable magnetic signature, a massive electromagnetic pulse that would have been detected by sensors across the North Pacific. He checked the data from his own institute. There was nothing. The seismic records for that day were even more curious. There was indeed a tremor recorded, the low-frequency hum the rumors spoke of, but its signature was unlike any natural earthquake. It was too regular, too rhythmic, almost like a signal. And then there was the most damning piece of information. The seismic data for that specific time period had been classified by order of the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. Why would the military be interested in a simple, geological event? Zaitsev began his own investigation, a dangerous and clandestine affair in a society where unauthorized curiosity was a political crime. He moved through the world of whispers, using old contacts, calling in forgotten favors. He met with a distraught medic who had treated the geologists upon their return. The men were not physically injured, the medic confided, but they were in a state of profound psychological shock, their stories disjointed and contradictory, as if they were struggling to describe something for which no words existed. They spoke of a silent light and a dark crystal. Then they stopped speaking altogether. They were debriefed not by scientists, but by men from the KGB's first chief directorate. Zaitsev knew what that meant. This was no longer a scientific inquiry. It was a matter of state security. His quest for knowledge had led him into the shadow world of espionage and counterintelligence. Undeterred, he pressed on. He charted a history of unusual events in the region, cross-referencing official reports with unofficial anecdotes from pilots, fishermen, and indigenous hunters. A pattern began to emerge. For decades, there had been stories of strange lights over the Kliuchevskaya volcano group, of mysterious objects seen descending into the Avacha Bay, of unexplained energy readings from the Uzon caldera. Each event, taken in isolation, could be dismissed, but together they painted a picture of a persistent, unexplained presence in this volatile corner of the world. Kamchatka, he began to theorize, was not just a geological hotspot. It was a window, a place where something could cross over. The official silence, the military involvement, the psychological state of the witnesses, it all pointed not to a cover-up of a natural event, but to the active suppression of an unnatural one. The state was not hiding its ignorance, it was guarding a secret. Zaitsev's investigation was now a race against time. The authorities were methodically erasing the event from history, confiscating records, silencing witnesses, creating a void where a profound mystery should be. He knew that if he was to find any proof, he would have to take a great risk. He would have to get closer to the source. He began to plan a trip to the Mutnovsky region under the guise of collecting volcanic gas samples for his official research. He knew he would be watched. He knew that the area would be guarded. But the pull of the unknown was stronger than the fear of the authorities. For a man like Arvid Zaitsev, a truth buried was a personal affront, a challenge to the very essence of the scientific spirit. He was no longer just a disgraced physicist. He was an investigator, the sole guardian of a fragile, impossible truth. He had to know what the geologists had seen. He had to understand the nature of the force that had risen from the earth and so terrified the most powerful state on the planet that its only response was to pretend that nothing had happened at all. The silence of the state was not empty. It was filled with the shape of the thing it was trying to hide. Returning to the heart of the encounter, to the frozen tableau of the 5 geologists and the silent, crystalline object, we must delve deeper into the anatomy of the event itself. The initial shock, that first wave of paralyzing disbelief, slowly gave way to a state of heightened, terrified observation. The men's scientific training, buried for a moment under an avalanche of primal fear, began to reassert itself. They were witnesses, and they had a duty to observe, to record, even if only in the fragile medium of memory. The diamond-shaped craft did not merely hover. It exhibited a subtle, deliberate behavior that suggested a purpose far beyond simple presence. From its lower facets, beams of light began to emerge. These were not lasers or searchlights. They were more like solid columns of pure, coherent energy, physical structures of light that descended into the volcano's fumaroles, the vents from which superheated gases escaped the Earth's core. The beams penetrated the steaming fissures without any visible effect on the surrounding rock. Yet the geologists felt a change in the air. The low hum intensified, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to resonate with a new energy, as if the volcano itself were being tuned like a vast telluric instrument. Viktor Orlov, his eyes wide, noticed that the steam rising from the vents near the energy beams was behaving strangely. It wasn't dispersing in the wind. Instead, it was being drawn back towards the craft, spiraling up the columns of light in a silent reverse waterfall. What was it doing? Was it drawing power from the volcano's immense geothermal furnace? Was it sampling the unique stew of minerals and gases from deep within the planet's mantle? Or was it something far more complex, an interaction with the Earth's electromagnetic field, using the volcano as a natural amplifier or a planetary acupuncture point? The object was a black box, its function as inscrutable as its origin. As the minutes stretched on, other environmental effects became apparent. The team's sensitive magnetometers, designed to measure fluctuations in the local magnetic field, began to spin erratically before their needles froze, pinned to the maximum reading. Their shortwave radio, their only link to the outside world, crackled with a violent storm of static before falling completely silent. Even their mechanical watches, simple, reliable Soviet-made timepieces, began to slow down, their second hands struggling against an unseen force. They were in a bubble of distorted physics, a localized field where the normal laws of nature had been suspended. A strange metallic scent, like ozone mixed with hot copper, filled the air, sharp and sterile. It was the smell of immense energy being discharged. The psychological impact on the men intensified. The initial terror was now blended with a profound and unsettling sense of insignificance. The object's presence was overwhelming, its intelligence palpable. It seemed to be aware of their small, fragile human forms huddled at the edge of the crater, yet it was utterly indifferent to them. They were no more significant than the lichens on the rocks, irrelevant bystanders to a process of cosmic importance. This was not an act of communication or a display of power for their benefit. They were simply witnessing a force of nature at work, a force as alien and as unconcerned with humanity as a distant supernova or the slow grind of a glacier. Dmitri, the young seismologist, later recalled a feeling of profound mental intrusion. It wasn't a voice or a message, but a sense of concepts being downloaded directly into his mind. Images of complex fractal geometry, the feeling of immense geological time, the chilling sensation of a vast, cold, non-human consciousness. He felt as if his own mind was a primitive device being scanned by a superior intelligence, its contents examined and dismissed in a fraction of a second. He felt a wave of vertigo and nausea, the psychic equivalent of decompression sickness. The object was not just physically present, it was psychically dominant, its very existence warping the cognitive landscape around it. Pavel, the stoic engineer, felt something different. He was overcome by a feeling of deep, instinctual reverence, an emotion he, a lifelong atheist, could only describe as religious. The object's perfect form, its silent, effortless power, struck him not as a piece of technology, but as a manifestation of the divine. It was an encounter with something that was so far beyond his comprehension that the only appropriate response was awe. He had the absurd, terrifying thought that if he were to kneel, it would be the most rational act of his life. For Viktor Orlov, the experience was one of intellectual demolition. Every principle of geology, physics, and chemistry that he had built his life upon was being systematically dismantled before his eyes. The object was a living refutation of his entire universe. It moved without propulsion, it generated energy without a visible source, and it interacted with the environment on a level that defied all known science. He was a master of a language that was no longer being spoken. He was trying to describe a star with the vocabulary of a single grain of sand. The encounter was a slow, deliberate, and terrifying education in the true scale of the unknown. The universe was not the orderly, predictable cosmos he had studied. It was a place of silent, crystalline giants that slumbered in the hearts of volcanoes, a place of forces and intelligences that operated on principles so advanced they would forever appear to be magic. And as this realization settled in, the object began to move again, signaling that the climax of this impossible event was at hand. The transition was as seamless as it was terrifying. The columns of light retracted into the craft's obsidian hull. The reverse waterfall of steam ceased, and the resonant hum that had vibrated through the men's bones began to change in pitch, climbing into a frequency that was felt more than heard. The air grew tense, charged with an immense potential, like the moment before a lightning strike. The 5 men, rooted to the spot, braced themselves for an unknown culmination. They expected an explosion, a blinding flash, a sudden departure. What happened instead was an act of quiet, incomprehensible artistry. The craft, still hovering in absolute silence, began to emit a new kind of light from its nadir. It was not a beam, but a broad, diffuse projection, a soft luminescence that painted a vast circle on the dark volcanic rock of the crater floor. Within this circle, a pattern began to form. Lines of light, thin as a spider's thread, began to trace a shape of staggering complexity. It was a geometric figure, a mandala of impossible intricacy, a fusion of crystalline structures and organic flowing curves. It was a design that seemed to contain both a mathematical proof and a piece of sacred art. It expanded outwards from the center, a silent, luminous flower blooming on the basalt canvas. The geologists watched, mesmerized. The pattern was alive. It shifted and evolved, its components rearranging themselves in a fluid, hypnotic dance. It was a language, Orloff realized with a jolt. They were being shown something, a map, a schematic, a message. The light was not hot, yet where it touched the rock, the ground itself began to change. The dark basalt began to glow with a dull cherry-red heat. The pattern was not being projected onto the rock. It was being etched into it, burned into the very molecular structure of the stone by a process that generated no ambient heat. It was a form of cold fusion, a focused energy transfer of impossible precision. As the intricate glyph grew to the size of a football field, the high-frequency vibration intensified, and the men experienced a new and profoundly disorienting phenomenon. Time itself seemed to dilate. The slow, majestic rotation of the luminous pattern seemed to stretch into an eternity, while their own thoughts raced at a frantic pace. They experienced a cascade of dissociated images and sensations. Orloff saw the entire geological history of the volcano unfold in his mind's eye, from its violent birth to its slow erosion, as if he were watching a film on fast forward. Pavel felt the immense pressure of the rock beneath him, the weight of the entire continent, a crushing sensation of being buried alive. Dmitri saw visions of star systems and nebulae, of worlds born and dying in cosmic firestorms. They were no longer just observers, they were participants, their consciousnesses forcibly entangled with the object's strange energies. The experience was an assault on the senses, a complete overload of the human cognitive apparatus. It was not communication in any human sense of the term. It was a raw data transfer, a direct interface with a non-human perception of reality, and their minds were simply not equipped to process it. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The luminous pattern on the ground faded, leaving behind a scorched, intricate scar on the crater floor. The high-frequency vibration ceased. The object, now utterly black and featureless once more, hung in the air for a final silent moment. It seemed to be waiting, observing the results of its work. The men, gasping for breath, their minds reeling from the psychic onslaught, could only stare at the sigil on the ground, a piece of alien graffiti left in the heart of their world. The departure was the final definitive violation of physics. The object did not accelerate into the sky. It did not break the sound barrier. It simply ceased to be. In one instant, it was there, a massive, tangible presence dominating the landscape. In the next, it was gone. Not flown away, but erased from existence. The only evidence of its passage was the profound, ringing silence it left behind, the scorched pattern on the rock, and the 5 shattered men who had witnessed the impossible. They stood in the twilight, the normal sounds of the volcano slowly returning, the hiss of steam seeming mundane and comforting after the profound strangeness of what they had just experienced. They looked at each other, their faces pale and drawn in the fading light. No words were exchanged. What could they possibly say? How could they describe the silent diamond, the columns of energy, the psychic assault, the glyph burned into the earth? They were men who had voyaged to a place far beyond the known world, and they had no maps to describe where they had been. They were left with a shared secret, a collective trauma that would bind them together and isolate them from the rest of humanity forever. The world they had returned to was the same one they had left minutes before, but they were irrevocably changed. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had shown them a geometric pattern of terrifying beauty. The silence of the Kamchatka evening was no longer peaceful. It was now filled with the echo of an impossible presence, a memory of a silent wound that had opened in the sky and vanished as if it had never been. The profound, alien silence that followed the object's departure did not last long. In the cold, thin air of the high altitude, a new sound began to grow, a familiar, rhythmic chopping that was, in its own way, as menacing as the silence it replaced. Within hours, the sky was filled with the thunder of Mil-Mi-8 transport helicopters, their dark, predatory shapes descending into the caldera like birds of prey. They did not bear the red star of the Soviet Air Force or the markings of any civilian agency. They were a sterile, menacing gray, unmarked and anonymous. Before the rotors had even stopped spinning, their doors slid open and figures rappelled to the ground. These were not a rescue party. They were Spetsnaz, the elite of Soviet special forces, clad in black combat gear, their faces impassive, their Kalashnikovs held at the ready. They moved with a chilling efficiency, establishing a perimeter around the geologists' camp, their movements practiced and precise. They were followed by another type of man. These men wore long, dark coats over severe, ill-fitting suits, their faces pale and indistinct, men who seemed to have been born and raised in windowless rooms. They carried no weapons, but they radiated an aura of absolute authority that was more intimidating than any rifle. Orlov recognized them instantly, the Committee for State Security, the KGB. The arrival of the authority was swift and total. The geologists were not questioned, they were processed, they were separated, their equipment confiscated, their geological samples and personal logbooks seized. Every rock, every piece of paper, every photograph was carefully bagged and catalogued by silent men in white protective suits who now swarmed the site. The scorched glyph on the crater floor became the focus of intense activity, covered with a massive tarpaulin as instruments were brought in to scan and analyze it. The message was clear and unequivocal. This place and everything that had happened in it no longer belonged to them. It now belonged to the state. Orlov and his men were herded into a helicopter, the roar of the engines drowning out any attempt at conversation. They were flown not to their base camp, but to a secure military installation on the coast. There, the second phase of the process began, the deconstruction of their reality. They were held in isolation, in sparse white rooms and subjected to days of intense debriefing. The interrogators were not brutal. They were worse. They were patient, methodical, and relentlessly psychological. They were not interested in what the geologists had seen. They were interested in what they were willing to unsay. The questions were circular, designed to create doubt and confusion. Are you sure the light wasn't just a reflection from a weather balloon? Could the shape have been an optical illusion caused by volcanic gases and ice crystals? The effects on your equipment are consistent with a powerful electromagnetic pulse, a known, if rare, natural phenomenon. Wouldn't you agree, Comrade Orlov? They were presented with falsified data, manufactured satellite images of unusual cloud formations, and expert testimony from a geophysicist who spoke eloquently about the theoretical possibility of magneto-hydrodynamic vortices in a geothermal environment. Slowly, methodically, their extraordinary experience was being buried under a mountain of mundane official explanation. The official story was being constructed around them, and they were expected to become its primary authors. The climax of this process was the signing of the documents. Each man was presented with a thick file. The first part was a pre-written statement, a detailed account of the plasma vortex event, an account that cleverly incorporated some elements of their experience while stripping them of all their strangeness. The second part was a non-disclosure agreement, a document binding them to a lifetime of absolute silence, backed by the full terrifying weight of the Soviet legal system. The penalties for breaking the oath were not ambiguous. Article 64 of the RSFSR Penal Code, treason, a crime punishable by 15 years in a labor camp or, in special circumstances, death. Viktor Orlov, a man of science who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of truth, was now being ordered to endorse a lie, to become a co-conspirator in the burial of the most significant discovery in human history. To refuse was to condemn himself and his family to ruin. To sign was to betray his own senses, his own mind, his own soul. He looked into the flat bureaucratic eyes of the man from the KGB, and he saw no room for negotiation. This was not a debate. This was the application of overwhelming force. One by one, the geologists signed. With a few strokes of a pen, their incredible truth was officially erased, replaced by a convenient fiction. The silent diamond in the volcano became a freak of the weather. The encounter with the sublime became a medical incident. Their history was rewritten, and they were forced to be its authors. The state had not just taken their evidence, it had taken their experience itself, claiming ownership of their memories. They were released, but they were not free. They were now prisoners of a secret they were forbidden to keep, and a lie they were forced to tell. The authority had won. The silent, faceless machine of the state had proven more powerful than the silent, crystalline God in the volcano. Or so it seemed. While the state was busy constructing its wall of silence around the Mutnovsky event, Arvid Zaitsev was looking for a way to tunnel through it. His official request to conduct atmospheric research near the volcano had been denied, as he expected, citing unstable geological conditions and ongoing military exercises. The denial was itself a confirmation. The quarantine was real, but Zaitsev was not so easily deterred. He had a contingency plan, a contact cultivated over years of quiet descent, a helicopter pilot, a cynical Afghan war veteran named Mikhail, who flew supply runs to remote outposts and was not above supplementing his meager state salary with a little freelance work, especially if it involved tweaking the noses of the authorities he so despised. For a significant sum of rubles and 2 bottles of high-quality Armenian brandy, Mikhail agreed to a detour. He would fly Zaitsev close to the restricted zone, under the pretense of a medical emergency at a nearby weather station, giving the physicist a window of no more than 30 minutes on the ground. It was a huge risk for both men. If they were caught, Mikhail would face a court-martial, and Zaitsev would undoubtedly find himself on a one-way trip to a place much colder and more remote than Kamchatka. As their helicopter approached the Mutnovsky caldera, Zaitsev could see the scope of the official operation. The entire area was a hive of activity. Temporary structures had been erected, a perimeter of military vehicles was clearly visible, and the crater floor, where the geologists' camp had been, was now a sterilized, barren patch of earth. The massive glyph Orlov's men had seen was gone, either covered over or physically removed, the rock scarified and disguised. The cleanup was thorough, professional, and chilling. They were not just studying the site, they were erasing it. Mikhail landed them in a small hidden valley a few kilometers from the crater's edge, shielded from view. The 30 minutes began. Zaitsev, carrying a small satchel of sampling equipment, scrambled up the treacherous volcanic slope, his lungs burning in the thin, sulfurous air. He didn't make it to the crater rim. He didn't have to. Halfway up the slope, he found what he was looking for. A small, discarded object glinting in the weak sunlight. It was a geologist's rock hammer, half buried in the scree, obviously dropped in haste and missed by the fastidious cleanup crews. And next to it, a single piece of rock, a fist-sized chunk of basalt with a peculiar, vitrified sheen on one surface, as if it had been exposed to a sudden, intense burst of energy. Zaitsev knew at once that this rock was not from the main event site. It was likely a piece of ejecta, something overlooked. He quickly took his samples, his hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear. He chipped off a piece of the vitrified rock, bagged it, and took control samples from the surrounding area. He also scooped up a sample of the fine volcanic soil around the hammer. He knew from the rumors that the men's equipment had malfunctioned. That suggested a powerful electromagnetic field. Such a field could leave traces, subtly altering the magnetic alignment of ferrous particles in the soil. Back in his clandestine laboratory in Petropavlovsk, working late into the night, Zaitsev began his analysis. The control samples were normal, their composition and magnetic properties exactly as expected for the region. But the samples from the site of the dropped hammer were anything but normal. The soil sample, when analyzed with a sensitive magnetometer, showed a bizarre magnetic anomaly. The particles were polarized, all pointing to a spot in the sky where the object had presumably hovered, a lingering magnetic ghost of the event. But it was the rock fragment that delivered the most stunning revelation. Under a high-powered electron microscope, the vitrified surface revealed a crystalline structure that had been fundamentally altered. The basalt had been flash-heated to a temperature of at least 4,000 degrees Celsius and then instantly cooled, a process that should have shattered it, but had instead created a thin layer of an unknown, glass-like substance. Within this glassy matrix, Zaitsev found microscopic metallic spherules. Using mass spectrometry, he analyzed their composition. They were an alloy of iron and nickel, common in meteorites, but they also contained isotopes of platinum and iridium in ratios that did not correspond to any known terrestrial or extraterrestrial source. They were, for lack of a better term, impossible. This was the proof. This was the smoking gun. This was a piece of physical evidence that refuted the official narrative of a plasma vortex. Ball lightning does not create exotic metal alloys or leave behind permanent magnetic signatures in the soil. This was the footprint of a technology far beyond human capability. Zaitsev felt a surge of triumph, immediately followed by a wave of cold dread. He was now in possession of a secret that the state would kill to protect. His small, smuggled rock sample was arguably the most dangerous object in the entire Soviet Union. He began to compile his findings into a report, a meticulous scientific document that detailed his methods, his analysis, and his explosive conclusions. He worked with a new sense of urgency, a feeling that he was being watched, that the net was closing in around him. He made copies of his report using the laborious pre-digital method of samizdat, typing the document over and over with carbon paper, creating a handful of precious illicit copies. He gave one to a trusted contact in the Academy of Sciences in Novosibirsk, another to a dissident journalist in Moscow. He kept one for himself, hidden in a secret compartment in his small apartment. He was building a firewall, ensuring that if he disappeared, his work would not disappear with him. The cover-up was almost perfect. The state had the witnesses, the site, and the official narrative. But they had missed one small rock, and in the hands of a man like Arvid Zaitsev, that one rock was enough to start an avalanche. The truth had been buried, but it had not been killed. It was now sleeping, waiting for the right moment to surface. For the 5 geologists, the aftermath of the encounter was a slow, quiet descent into a life sentence of silence and dislocation. After signing their confessions and oaths of secrecy, they were not returned to their unit. They were scattered to the winds, a deliberate act of social engineering designed to prevent them from ever corroborating their stories or forming a community of shared experience. Their professional lives, once a source of pride and purpose, were systematically dismantled. Viktor Orlov, the seasoned expedition leader, a man who only felt alive in the vast open spaces of the wilderness, was reassigned to a dreary administrative post at a geological archive in Irkutsk. He spent his days in a dusty, fluorescent-lit basement cataloging old maps and survey reports, a lion caged in a bureaucratic zoo. He was surrounded by the language of the earth, the familiar names of mountain ranges and river basins. But it was a dead language now, a constant, painful reminder of the vibrant, living world from which he had been exiled. The state had not imprisoned his body, but it had effectively incarcerated his soul. His nights were plagued by nightmares. He would see the silent diamond hanging in a sky of black velvet, its crystalline facets reflecting a profound and terrifying emptiness. He would see the luminous glyph burning itself into the ground, a symbol he felt he almost understood upon waking, but whose meaning always remained just out of reach. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the low-frequency hum of the object vibrating in his memory. He tried to talk to his wife, but the words would not come. How could he explain the feeling of cosmic indifference, the psychic weight of that non-human consciousness? The oath of secrecy was more than a legal document. It had become a psychological barrier, a wall of silence that isolated him even from those he loved most. The other members of the team fared no better. Dmitri, the bright young seismologist, was transferred to a mind-numbing job monitoring oil pipelines in western Siberia. His promising career was over before it had begun. He became withdrawn and cynical, seeking solace in vodka, his brilliant mind slowly drowning in a sea of state-sanctioned mediocrity. Pavel, the sturdy engineer, was forced into early retirement, his health mysteriously failing. He returned to his hometown in Ukraine, a broken man who would sit for hours staring at the sky, as if waiting for something to return. Sergei and Ivan, the two assistants, simply vanished. Their official records stated they had been transferred to a new, classified project in the far north, a common euphemism for a posting from which one did not return. Orlov suspected they had been deemed less reliable, less capable of maintaining the complex lie, and had been permanently silenced. The men were haunted not only by what they had seen, but by their own complicity in its denial. They had been forced to betray the most profound experience of their lives. This act of intellectual and spiritual treason ate away at them, a slow-acting poison for which there was no antidote. They were living ghosts, men out of time, their lives defined by a single impossible event that they were forbidden to acknowledge. The shared trauma that should have bonded them for life was twisted into a tool of their isolation. They were forbidden from contacting one another. Any attempt to do so would be seen as a conspiracy, a violation of their oath. Each man was left alone with his incredible memory, forced to wonder if the others remembered it as he did, or if he was, in fact, going mad. Was the memory real, or was it a shared delusion, a folie à cinq induced by volcanic gases and psychological stress, just as the men in the dark coats had suggested? The state's cover-up was a masterclass in psychological warfare. By isolating the witnesses and systematically gaslighting them, they turned a shared certainty into a private doubt. The event itself was so far outside the realm of normal human experience that, without constant reinforcement from others, the memory began to feel dreamlike, unreal. Perhaps the plasma vortex was the true story. Perhaps the silent diamond was just a nightmare. It was an easier reality to live in. But for Orlov, the truth was branded into his soul. He would occasionally, late at night, take out a piece of paper and try to sketch the complex glyph he had seen burned into the crater floor. He could never get it right, but the act of trying was a small rebellion, a private ritual of remembrance. He was a keeper of a forbidden flame, a secret high priest of a religion with only one terrified adherent. His life became a quiet, lonely vigil. He scanned the scientific journals for any mention of strange atmospheric phenomena. He listened to the faint whispers of other unexplained events that circulated on the fringes of the scientific community. He was waiting for a sign, for some other evidence to emerge that would validate his experience and shatter the official lie. He was waiting for the world to catch up to the terrible, magnificent truth he had been forced to carry alone, a truth as heavy and as cold as a fragment of a distant, dying star. The silence was his prison, but it was also his sanctuary, the only place where the memory of the silent diamond remained pure and untainted by the corrosive lies of the world. The Mutnovsky caldera event exists as a void, a carefully excised chapter in the official history of the 20th century. In the absence of facts, speculation thrives. The theories that have emerged from the whispers and the fragmented data of Arvid Zaitsev's Samizdat report are as strange and as varied as the phenomenon itself. What was the object that Viktor Orlov and his men witnessed? What was its purpose? The most straightforward and perhaps most terrifying explanation is the extraterrestrial hypothesis. The object was a probe, a drone, or a vessel from another world, its intelligence and technology so far advanced as to be incomprehensible to us. In this view, the crystalline shape, the silent propulsion, the manipulation of energy and matter are all hallmarks of a civilization that has mastered the fundamental forces of the universe. But why a volcano? Proponents of this theory suggest that such a craft would require immense amounts of energy to operate, perhaps to power its propulsion system or to open a gateway for interstellar travel. A volcano is a natural power plant, a direct tap into the planet's thermal and electromagnetic core. The object may have been refueling, using the Earth's geothermal energy like a car at a gas station. Or perhaps it was conducting a geological survey, analyzing the composition of our planet's mantle for reasons we can only guess at. The scorched glyph could have been a byproduct of this process, a residual energy pattern, or it could have been a deliberate marker, a calling card, a piece of information left behind for a purpose we cannot discern. A second, more paranoid theory takes root in the Cold War context of the event. Could the object have been a secret weapon, a product of a black project so advanced that even most of the Soviet leadership was unaware of its existence? The Soviet Union was known to have poured vast resources into fringe science, investigating everything from psychotronics to torsion fields. Perhaps they had achieved a breakthrough, a leap in physics that allowed for the creation of gravity-defying craft powered by zero-point energy. The object could have been a prototype geothermal energy extractor, a technology that would have given the USSR energy independence and a massive strategic advantage. In this scenario, the encounter with the geologists was an accident, an unforeseen complication. The subsequent cover-up was not to hide the existence of aliens, but to protect the most valuable technological secret on Earth from the prying eyes of the West. This theory is compelling because it explains the massive state-level response. The authorities were not hiding a mystery, they were guarding their crown jewels. But does it explain the object itself? Could even the most advanced human science in 1982 produce a craft that could materialize and dematerialize at will? A third and more esoteric hypothesis pushes the boundaries of our understanding of reality itself. This is the ultra-terrestrial or crypto-terrestrial idea, which posits that these intelligences are not from other stars but are native to Earth. They are a parallel civilization, ancient and non-human, that has always existed alongside us, hidden in the deep, inaccessible parts of our own planet, the bottom of the oceans, the polar ice caps, or deep within the Earth's crust. In this view, volcanoes and deep-sea trenches are not just geological features, they are gateways to this other world, highways for a civilization that sees our surface world as a strange and alien environment. This theory resonates powerfully with the ancient myths of the Itelmen people, with their tales of fire spirits and underworld journeys. It suggests that our ancestors were not inventing stories, but were describing literal encounters with these deep earth dwellers. The object, then, was not a visitor from afar, but a local returning to its home. Its interaction with the volcano was not refueling, but a routine act, like a man opening the door to his own house. The glyph it left behind might have been a key, a navigational marker, or a symbol of ownership, branding the volcano as part of its domain. Each of these theories offers a different lens through which to view the event, and each carries its own profound implications. Are we sharing our planet with a hidden intelligence? Are our governments in possession of technologies that could rewrite our entire civilization? Or are we merely a primitive species, occasionally observed by galactic visitors who view our entire world as a curious geological specimen? Arvid Zaitsev, in the final speculative pages of his report, refused to commit to any single explanation. He was a scientist, and the data was insufficient. He merely presented the possibilities, each one more world-altering than the last. He concluded that the object's behavior was fundamentally ambiguous. It was a Rorschach test for humanity. We see in it what we are prepared to see: a threat, a technological marvel, a god, a demon. But the one thing we cannot see it as, he wrote, is non-existent. The evidence, however suppressed, proved that something had happened. The nature of that something remains the central unanswered question, a question that hangs over the Mutnovsky caldera like a ghost, a silent, diamond-shaped enigma. The legacy of the Mutnovsky event is one of profound and deliberate silence. It is a story that exists only in the margins, a historical footnote written in invisible ink. The official record is a blank page. In the archives of the Russian Federation, the files relating to the military quarantine of the region in August 1982 remain sealed, classified at the highest level, not to be opened until the year 2082, if ever. The official explanation of a plasma vortex was never widely publicized. It was simply entered into the appropriate reports and filed away, a bureaucratic fiction designed not to convince the public, but to close the case. The state did not need to create a convincing lie. It merely needed to create an official one. The silence from the authorities has been absolute. No government official, no military officer, no state-employed scientist has ever spoken on the record about what happened. The event has been surgically removed from the collective memory, a phantom limb of history that only a few can still feel. The site itself has been transformed. The Mutnovsky volcano and the surrounding area were permanently designated a restricted military zone. The official reason given was the proximity to a sensitive naval base and the need to protect the fragile geothermal environment. But those who know the whispers understand the real reason. The place is under guard. It is being watched, or perhaps it is being waited for. The human cost of this silence is immeasurable. The lives of Viktor Orlov and his men were collateral damage in a war of information they did not even know was being fought. Their story serves as a chilling testament to the power of a state to control not just information, but reality itself. They became unpeople, their experiences invalidated, their lives permanently scarred by a memory they had to pretend was a dream. Orlov lived out his years in his quiet exile in Irkutsk, passing away in the late 1990s, taking his secret to the grave. His wife found his sketches of the strange glyph after his death, not understanding their meaning, but keeping them as a memento of the private obsession that had consumed her husband's final years. But secrets, like energy, cannot be destroyed. They can only be transformed. The samizdat report of Arvid Zaitsev survived. His intellectual firewall worked. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, one of his copies surfaced in the chaotic new world of Russian free press. It was published in a small, obscure journal dedicated to unexplained phenomena, a single data point in a sea of speculation. It was largely ignored by the mainstream, dismissed as a Cold War fantasy, a piece of anti-Soviet propaganda, or simply the ravings of a madman. But it did not disappear. It was translated, passed around on the fledgling internet, and found its way to a small, dedicated community of researchers and investigators around the world. For them, Zaitsev's meticulous scientific analysis, combined with the raw human tragedy of the witnesses' stories, represented something extraordinary. A case with credible witnesses, a specific location, physical evidence, and a documented high-level cover-up. It became an underground classic, a legendary case file whispered about in the circles of those who dare to look for answers in the shadows. The Mutnovsky event thus lives a double life. In the official world, it does not exist. In the subculture of the unexplained, it is a cornerstone, a piece of evidence that suggests the truth is far stranger than we imagine. The final lingering question is, why? Why the massive multi-decade cover-up? If the object was a secret Soviet weapon, surely its existence would have been revealed after the Cold War ended, a final piece of technological bravado. If it was extraterrestrial, why the intense secrecy? Was the state hiding the truth to prevent public panic, as is so often claimed? Or were they hiding their own impotence, the terrifying realization that they were utterly powerless in the face of a superior intelligence operating with impunity in their own sovereign airspace? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the authorities did not know what it was. The cover-up was not to hide a known truth, but to contain an unknown one. The object was a variable so alien, so far outside their understanding that it threatened the very foundations of their power, a power built on the illusion of control and omniscience. They silenced the witnesses and buried the evidence not because they had an answer, but because they had no answer at all. And so, the silence from Mutnovsky continues. It is a heavy, loaded silence, filled with the echoes of a low-frequency hum, the ghost of a crystalline diamond, and the unanswered questions of 5 men whose lives were stolen by a truth they were not allowed to tell. It asks us to consider how many other such stories have been erased, how many other witnesses have been silenced. It challenges us to look at the blank spaces on the map, the classified files in the archives, the official denials from the authorities, and to see them not as an absence of evidence, but as the evidence itself. For in the world of profound secrets, the loudest sound is often the silence.